Good evening and welcome to the Velocity of Now with me, your host Thomas Sheridan, on the Reality Bites radio network. That's Reality Bites with a BY radio.com with Paula and Neil at the controls, and thanks to everyone else like Anne and all the other people behind the show and all the other stations for hosting this program, which I know you're enjoying and I'm enjoying very much as we continue this saunter into the ancient past to try and understand if there are any gems or pearls of wisdom within there that can guide us through the present future. You know what I always say, mythology is not a myth. Mythology is the most real thing of all. It's just that it's been sold the wrong way. Well, except for people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, but mythology is the true story of how we really are, told in allegory. But sometimes mythology is actually real or partially real. And that's what tonight's show is going to be about. We're going to be talking about Merlin. Yes, Merlin of King Arthur fame. Before then, I want to give some details. My website is thomassheridanarts.com. All the shows are recorded and uploaded onto my YouTube channel, which is Thomas Sheridan Arts, and I'd be very, very grateful if you could subscribe there and share those videos. And if you want to help me out, you can buy a book. There's a tab at thomassheridanarts.com, and you can also get links through there to all my blogs and my artwork and everything else. And the current blog that I've started, which I'm enjoying very much, called The Triskel and the Dragon, which deals with the subjects we've been talking about both tonight and on the show in recent weeks and months, and hopefully for the foreseeable future, because this is an important topic. I'm enjoying it very much, and I hope you are too. Today on the Triskel and the Dragon blog, I posted an article about St. Patrick. Controversial. Was St. Patrick just a war criminal? Well, I think he was. I think there's absolutely no proof that he was a humble shepherd boy, and vast amounts of proof that he was the Henry Kissinger of the Western Roman Empire back in the 6th century, in the 4th and 5th century, sorry. And there is I quote some real evidence there of his own letters back to the Pope, but so many of these stories from that period, what they call the Dark Ages, are told in the form of allegory and outright lies. Now, we cannot believe for a second that St. Patrick took down the command and centralized power structure of Tara by just lighting a silly fire on Beltane. He obviously had military backing and people on his side, because literally a cold nation does not surrender to one guy with magic fire. I will post the link to that article which I've written today below this recording of the show on the YouTube channel Thomas Sheridan Arts, and please check that out, because this is important stuff. Because we always hear about how the indigenous this and that of the rest of the world, the indigenous tribes of Africa, the indigenous tribes of Asia, of North America. Well, we forget that we have had our indigenous tribes in Europe wiped out as well. And while people are worried about the Bushmen and the shaman and all this around the world, they forget that we had that stolen from us too. We were the first line of attack by the Roman Empire, and hopefully, by having this narrative and starting to re-examine our history, and I see it happening around me all the time, maybe this could be the fight back. We've waited almost 2,000 years, at least 1,500 years, to get to this point, but history is changing fast, and people are waking up fast. Now, big-time religion is collapsing in Europe and in North America, and most of the English-speaking and, shall we say, the first world, as they used to call it. Now, the vacuum is rapidly being filled by two things: the atheism of Richard Dawkins, that type of like mythbusters, like infantile. Did I say racism? Sorry, I meant atheism, and also the maybe that was a Freudian slip, and also the New Age movement. The people who are interested in heathen and tribal subjects, and I'm not just talking about like pagans and heathens in Europe. I'm talking about people who Native American, Indian, Australian Aborigines, African. and so on. And even people who are from pre-Islamic, Middle Eastern parts of the world, we can jump in and help fill the vacuum. It's important. We can fill this vacuum with returning back in a modern sense to our original spiritual traditions. What's wrong with that? I see no harm in it. In fact, I see a hell of a lot more good than the centralized Abrahamic structures that have been foisted upon us for the last 2,000 or so years in the West. It's time for, shall we say, a true restoration, an indigenous restoration, the return of the native, or to bring back the snakes. Now, Merlin, Merlin, Arthurian legend. This was a tricky one for me because I'm not a big fan of the whole Arthurian legend, because a lot of it is just basically like the Grail mysteries of Europe, is essentially Christianity told through a different form. But at the same time, too, there's real truths to it. Now, I'm not going to get too tied up in King Arthur. My main focus tonight is Merlin. And Merlin is a tremendous subject. It's probably the only part of that story that in any way interests me. Mainly because, believe it or not, unlike King Arthur, we can pin down this man, this so-called wizard or magician, to a very specific time and place. He's not an allegory. He's like St. Patrick. He's someone we have real historical records of. And this makes it most interesting indeed. Now, before I talk about the two basic versions of Merlin, I want to read from this book called The Chronicles of the Celts by a guy called Ian Zachzek, I hope that pronounces his name. And it's just a simple introduction on the Arthurian link with the Celtic world. And Mr. Zachzek writes, of course, no story unified the various Celtic traditions as completely as that of King Arthur. Many authorities have cited elements in the early Irish sagas which are said to prefigure his exploits. Thus, Finn, that's Finn McCool, is seen as the early version of Arthur, while the story of Diarmid and Grania is supposed to have served as the model for the romance of Tristram and Isolde. Similarly, comparisons are made between the Siobhan Gelt and Merlin. And there is also the celebrated tale of the sorcerer steals a stone circle known as the Giant's Dances and used it to make Stonehenge. Another less slanderous version of the legend relates that Merlin entered the circle by moonlight and began to play his harp so sweetly that the stones came to life and danced across the Irish Sea of their own accord. The Arthurian sections on the Mabillon going are even more remarkable. How Coolwich won Ulwin, probably the oldest tale of collections, we gain one of the earliest sightings of the hero. He is already a king, but his court, we're talking about Arthur now, his court is situated at Ikelliwig in Cornwall. As a character, Arthur appears to have been well established, suggesting that it may well have been earlier stories that are now lost. Even so, he plays a comparative minor role in the proceedings, outshone by two of his followers, Kai, later Sir Kai, and Bedwyr, later Sir Bedivere. These colourful creations are very different from the courtly figures that were to emerge in the Arthurian romance legends. In spirit, their strange gifts and supernatural prowess made them much closer to Cuchulainn and his compatriots than to any of the knights described by Malory and Sieartrin de Troyes. The tale of Perendur, the tale of Perendur is considerably later and certainly be classified as a romance. The eponymous hero has many affinities with Sir Percival, and there are several links with the quest for the Holy Grail. The most notable of these are Perendur's lame uncle, who can probably be identified as the crippled Fisher King, and the tantalizing vision of the Holy Lance and the Grail itself, which Peredur witnesses in his castle. Outside the Mabor y Rogion, most Welsh associations with the Arthurian tradition are centered around Merlin. According to legend, he was born in Carmarthen, meaning Cair Merlin, the early form of his name, which we'll talk about in a bit. And there's no accident that the modern movement was Easterfjord movement was launched there. Brittany also boasts a close association with the wizard. There, as Brittany is in northern France. There, Merlin is said to have fashioned the round table for Arthur, and there too, in the forest of Brokrinlande, he is said to have met the enchantress Vivian. Tradition tells us that there he remains to this day, held captive by her in her invisible prison. Now that's an interesting allegory. We're going to talk about that one as well. But there we are hearing one side of the Merlin myth. Now, the popularity of the Merlin story was really brought into universal understanding by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth, a couple of hundred years later, wrote in Latin the Arthurian tales and legends. Now, he did mix up and make a combination of various legends and stories around the time, but ultimately what he was creating was a political document. It was like the creation manifesto of the New England. See, England had basically been torn for up until that period, and much later, between the Saxons and the Romano Britons. Now, the Romano Britons, although they were Celtic like Arthur, their allegiances were essentially, by the time of what we're told of Arthur's time, was to Rome and to the Roman Church. This is a pivotal point of understanding in all this, in the sense that it did not associate being English with necessarily with being English, or should I say Celtic or Roman or Breton. It associated English with not being Saxon, i.e. not being Northern German and Danish and so on, that part of the world. The Geoffrey of Monmouth's tales of Arthur were a solidification of this ideal that remained and possibly remains up until today, that somehow England is the descendant of the Roman Empire, and it was based on almost a neuroses that England and Britain had never recovered since the Romans left. In fact, this post-Roman Empire neuroses didn't only affect England, it affected far more than that. You look at the Renaissance or the Renaissance in Italy and throughout Europe in the 16th century. It wasn't called the Renaissance for nothing. They were literally trying to rejuvenate, revive, and restore the Roman Empire as it had been at the time of Imperial Rome, 1500 years and more prior to that. It was about bringing Rome back. And even the creation of the United States, you had neoclassical architecture, constant references by the founding fathers to Rome and to the classical world. And indeed, this is why the wealthy slave owners gave their slaves names like Cassius, Flavius, and names like that, because they literally saw themselves as Roman governors in Virginia and other states in the southern US, not only exclusively in the southern US, but even in parts of the north like Pennsylvania. Wherever they had slaves, they seemed to be obsessed with giving them Roman names, because again, for all their talk of a new republic, remember that word republic, it doesn't belong to anybody other than the Romans. They were obsessed with rejuvenating Rome in the New World. Hence why all the American buildings, from Monticello to all the buildings, the buildings in Washington, D.C., all resemble classical architecture. And not just the United States, it was common all over Europe as well, and all over the world. So Geoffrey of Monmouth's tales of Arthur served two functions. They were kind of a weaponized propaganda to create this creation myth of the Britons and the English, would you say, that was non-Saxon in origin, much to the should we say, the misfortune of the people of England. And secondly, to create this belief that there was a magical destiny behind the English and behind the creation of Britain. And this magical destiny was the resurgence of Rome in England. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote these tales in Latin, and they instantly became a massive sensation because they're fantastic stories. They're just, no matter how you look at them, as silly as they're fabulous stories. They have everything, but they were not only a huge hit in England among the Cambrio Normans. These are basically French people. Remember, England was under this at this time is basically under French control, and some say it has been ever since. But also, it was a huge success all over the world. Sorry, all over Europe, particularly in Italy, where the Arthurian legends were extremely popular. Now, a huge part of the, shall we say, the popular success, and believe me, it was enormous. They were like the Dan Brown novels of their day, of these tales was a series of prophecies in them by Merlin. Now, Merlin the wizard. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth had basically made him into a Nostradamus type figure, but canny bastard that he was, what he did was he pre-wrote or pre-scripted prophecies from the future and wrote them back in time to make it look like Merlin would had made these prophecies. It'd be like if somebody today decided now to write a book of Nostradamus and then go back and say Nostradamus predicted Hitler lost World War II, Nostradamus predicted that Kennedy was shot, blah blah blah, and so on. It was basically a scam, but people didn't care. They love prophecy. There's something about people, they love prophecy, and they ultimately built around the idea again that Rome would return, and that somehow at the central part of this legend is the idea that Britain, Romano Britain, is a central part of this. An interesting tale that's written in the story by Geoffrey is one concerning the character Merlin. Now, Merlin, we're now talking about the mythical Merlin, not the real one. Remember, we're going to talk about the real one later. But there's some very interesting stories in there, including the origin of Merlin. Merlin was said to be half demon, and this is important before we go and look at the real Merlin. Merlin's mother was a wealthy woman who became a nun and went to a convent where she was impregnated by a succubus or an incubus, whichever is the male one, a demon, so she says. And Merlin was the spawn or the offspring of this union. Merlin was half demon. Now, why he wasn't executed for that is kind of, whether he existed or why it was never even suggested, was interesting because basically he was because of his noble stature, they only put poor people to the sword for these things. But anyway, because of this half demon status, he was essentially considered magical, and he had powers of prophecy, and he could see into the future and all these other things that's associated with the mythical Merlin. Now, one of them involved the tale regarding two dragons that were. As a child, there was a castle that was falling down in Wales, and he was brought to the castle initially to be sacrificed. I believe they believe the blood of a young boy would actually help build the structure better. That's the roots of Freemasonry and so on. Remember and those of you who've seen my documentary on Prussian nobility, and I showed how the body of a baby, the corpse of a baby, was used to seal the treaty. There was these civilized people were still obsessed with putting blood of children and innocent people on their structures. That's what the roots of the Freemasonic origin of putting the oil and the fat on the end of the building. It was originally the fat of a young child, and now they put the fat of a goose or something on it. the wine was actually their blood. So anyway, he was brought over for this murder ritual to protect the castle. While there, he said there were two dragons under the ground. One was a white dragon and one was a red dragon, which is interesting in itself because that's the color of the English flag, the flag of England, not the Union flag, and that the later on became that. And the one dragon represented the Saxons, and one dragon represented the Romano Britons, and the Romano Britons would prevail, but the Saxons would return. And this is what really happened in real life, and this was all again part of Geoffrey of Monmouth backlogging, shall we say, real history onto the Merlin prophecy stories. And that's the Merlin story that has come down to us today. That's in popular understanding. That's the Merlin of that movie Excalibur that was made in the early 80s, the Merlin TV shows, all the other Arthurian stories we've been raised with as kids. And again, they're great stories, but they're not real. They're more or less propaganda to unify Britain, or safeguard the British consciousness at a time when it had a kind of identity crisis. Was it Anglo-Saxon? Was it Saxon? Was it Celtic? Was it Romano Britain? And basically said to them, look, this is what you are. You're English, you're Britain, but you're in the context of a Christianized king. So it was ultimately a Christian legend. It was a Christian saga. You had the Knights of the Round Table were essentially the apostles. Merlin was essentially John the Baptist, and so on. In fact, that's an interesting one as well, because it has been speculated by some scholars that Mer, in his name, Mer, comes from Mar, which is in Gaelic and Celtic and many languages. Mar is the sea, so the man of the sea. And that's something that's an interesting point as well. But the reason why Merlin what his name was Merlin was because the real character he's based on was someone called Midrin. Midrin. And Midrin could not be directly translated into into Latin. That was the language of literature back then, because it would have meant literally the excremented one, or covered in excrement. But that may be a psyop in its own kind of interesting way too, to degrade what Midrin, the real Merlin, who we're going to talk about next, represented. Now, the real Merlin story is very dark and suggests a very different character than the one in the Arthurian legends. In fact, reading between the lines, now we're talking about a real person, and then overlaying how the Arthurian myths ended up, we're left with a very dark character, almost like a Gollum in Lord of the Rings type individual. Now, we can actually pin this down to a real individual. The guy Midrin, on which Merlin is based, took part in a battle, the Battle of Aferdiad, which took place near Hadrian's Wall on the Scottish-English borders in the north of England in AD 537. This is historical fact. This is not a made-up battle. This really took place, and the individuals mentioned in the Midrin story were there, including Midrin himself. The battle was a bloodbath and a catastrophe, and Midrin, who was on the losing side, essentially suffered from what we would call today post-traumatic stress trauma. He, just like troops coming back from the Middle East or coming back from Iran or Iraq these days, he went crazy at the sight of all his friends being killed, the bloodbath, and probably some of the things he did himself to individuals on the battlefield. He went basically insane. Now, what happened next is the interesting part. He withdrew from society and went to live in the dense, remote forest regions in southern Scotland, where he became a wild man. Again, think of him as a Gollum. He was disliked by his own people. He was an outcast from society. He was on the run from the Christian kings and from the Christian authorities, and he lived as basically this bushman. Dark Ages, wild man living in the forest. Now, this is a common story in many Celtic traditions of the wild man in the woods who becomes another kind of human being. I often wonder if this was the origin of Tolkien's the Ents, the shepherds of the forest in the Lord of the Rings, in his own stories. But he entered into the woods, and it said that he lived off the wild fruits of the woods and began to communicate with animals, trees, and nature. Now, this would suggest psychedelics to me. This would suggest this individual who's already in a deep state of psychic breakdown following the events of the Battle of Aberfidrid, and his mental breakdown, entering into the forest with all the psychic and emotional confusion, living off, the land. He would have eventually stumbled upon things like magic mushrooms and other forms of psychedelics, and may have been the creation of Mithrin or Merlin the wizard. But he did exist, and he was a real character. This idea of this individual and then returning from the forest with these what were seen as magical powers would have made him politically a very useful figure for two reasons. If he was someone of a higher standing and he came back from this state, if he could be either brought into the Christian court or converted to Christianity as a high-profile convert, politically he could be a very powerful weapon for the Romano Britons. And I think that's what happened. I think this guy, this is where the darkness part comes in. I think that he was actually a dark sorcerer working within Christianity to undermine the Romano Britons, whom he despised secretly, while all the time being a druid. If you know what I mean. He was like a double agent. His access to the power structure in Britain that time, right up to royalty, would have allowed him to use his influence to control the power structure in a way that was unique to a holy man. Remember, they all had spiritual advisors, and the transition between paganism and Christianity literally didn't happen overnight. Even if there was conversions, there was, like in St. Patrick, when he was converting the wealthy pagan Irish, was doing it by bribing them. Even many of the ones he bribed dropped out of his mission during it, took the money and left, because you cannot change these. You can't have a fate switched overnight. It's not like, I've seen the light, I've seen Jesus, and then the next day that next moment you're a Christian. We are talking about thousands of years of tradition. So having someone like a pagan wild man priest kind of character, and he did enter into a monastery after he returned from the woods, would politically be very useful, but also socially and culturally very useful, in order to allow the ruling structures to ease the transition between paganism and Christianity, and in this case, Roman Christianity. So you imagine this dark character, someone who's been basically changed, who knows, maybe even possessed by his experiences in the woods of Scotland, coming out, spending time in a monastery, and then entering back into the upper echelon of Romano-British society at the time when they were under incredible political and military pressure by the Saxons, whom they were at war with, who had been invading the north of England in particular on and off for a couple of hundred years. Pagan Saxons. You would have had someone with an understanding, a kind of a let's talk about this in a good example. Merlin or Mithrin would have been the Dark Ages version of Rasputin. You think of Rasputin. Now, Rasputin was very similar as well. Clearly a mystic, another wild man from the woods, from a backwater, crazed, eccentric, but with powers that seemed supernatural and beyond what the Christians could do. Now, he was brought into the highest levels of the Romanov, interesting enough, the Romanov household dynasty, at a time when the Romanovs and the power structure in Russia had been rattled following their defeat against the war against Japan in the East. There was a psychic breakdown and a lack of psychic integration that this, amazingly, it always seems to happen, this individual comes along called Rasputin and glues the royal family back into a psychic structure to the point where both the Tsar and the Tsarina completely trust him. The strangeness of a creature or a person or an individual in a situation like that can often be an asset when nothing else makes sense and is falling apart. This is why people often join cults at the worst part of their life, when they've had a breakdown in a family, the death of a child. They're looking for any kind of answers, a breakup of a family, an emotional breakdown, and no matter how crazy the cult is, all it has to do is jump into that fracture in the psyche of the individual or the family, and they have them. When psychic integration breaks down, this is when this stuff can jump in. And you had a similar situation in England when this Merlin character comes along. What this Merlin character seems to have done from my own study of him, and remember we're dealing with someone we have a lot of information on, this Mithrin character, is he was called the son of a devil and a servant of God. Geoffrey of Monmouth had said that he was half demon and half nun. Again, allegory for that he was half pagan and half Christian. The Druids did not necessarily all become Christians or were killed. Many of the most powerful ones, would have either went into hiding or became servants of the Christian king, posing as converts, in reality double agents, working under the radar, posing under the guise of someone who understands the old tradition very well, and you need us to help turn them into the new fate of Rome. We can be almost like consultants. Merlin was the son of a devil and a servant of God. So Merlin, that's how he was described. A Mithrin was the son of a devil and the servant of God. Half pagan, half Christian. But who was he really working for? And that's where the story really gets interesting for me. Merlin could have been anything, Mithrin could have been anything from a Saxon spy who was undermining the religious and the aristocratic power structure in England for the benefit of the Saxons, hence the story of the Saxon dragon and the Romano-British dragon under the ground, this prophecy he made. Knowing well, based on both his experiences having been defeated by a Christian army, which drove him into madness and drove him into the woods, and perhaps a leftover from a different time which did not have fond memories of the Romans. Now remember, the Romans conquered Britain, and the Romans themselves said this, I believe it was Tacitus said this, that the Romans did not capture the British by force. They captured them by seduction. He even mentioned in his history of Britain that within no time the British were bathing in the Roman baths, drinking Roman wines, and wearing Roman gowns. Little did they know that these were their chains and this was their prison. So the Romans had turned Britain into a prison. Mithrin or Merlin, while in his wild feral state, may have gotten a taste of what Britain, and he would have met other wild men, and many of them would have been intergenerational refugees from the Romans. This is where the story of this common story in Celtic worlds all over Europe comes from, of the wild men in the woods. These were the dropouts. These were the ones who said, no way, I'm not going to follow the Roman system, and they ran off into the woods. And their legacy has been very powerful in Europe because they were sort of like the dropouts, the survivalists, keeping the flame alive. They saw Europe as under the control of a monstrous Roman power structure, which it was when you really look at it. And they became the wild men who lived in the woods. And where is this the origin of the green man idea? Especially when you think about the green man and the Sheila na gig, the grotesque woman holding her vagina open. Was that the pagan woman and the pagan man, the wild man and the wild woman living in the woods? Was it placed over the nave of churches to remind people of like what the alternative was? By then they would have been, I'm talking about early churches, Cistercian monasteries, in those kinds of things in the early days, to remind them that this is what awaits you if you stray from the path of Roman Christianity. To place in the idea that this was the future and they represented the horrid past. Did Mithrin or Merlin, I'd prefer Mithrin, did he, while he was in the Scottish woods, come into contact with these groups? That when he emerged and went into a monastery and became Christianized, the Arthurian legends romanticized it that it was eventually Arthur, who didn't exist, was the one who basically slowly converted him. There was something else going on. This was the son of a devil, the smartest devil of them all. The servant of God was purely an act by this character to undermine the Romano-British structure in order to bring the Saxons in. And the Saxons did come back and they did become the dominant force for a very, very long time until the arrival of the Normans, and also when Wessex became a power as well. The history of England is very, very interesting. The history of England in the Dark Ages is, up until the Norman invasion, is almost like a chessboard for the history of the world that was to follow. You had all these forces basically had been using the Isle to have this grand battle, almost like a battle of Armageddon. And this is how the people would have seen it. There was a great plague in the 5th century, and many people believed that this was the end of the world. So the Battle of Armageddon was taking place in England during the Dark Ages. Now, why did they call them the Dark Ages? Well, called the Dark Ages because the laws of Rome had collapsed. And I see these people in the awakened, so-called awakened community, talking about talk about the Dark Ages if they were horrible. The Dark Ages were actually a time of great enlightenment in many ways. It was the Middle Ages which followed them, which is where all the horrors of the church took place. And often they will have tapestries or images from the Middle Ages, and they'll say they didn't call the Dark Ages for nothing. The Dark Ages was a time of shadow. Europe had fallen into shadow. Now, shadows are created by bright lights, and the bright light was the illumination of European hedonism and paganism from the north, which had put Christian Europe and Roman Europe into shadow. Remember, shadow, the darkest shadow is created by the brightest light. The brightest light was the northern lights of the heathens, particularly the Norse Vikings, who were resisting successfully the rule of Rome. This came later. But anyway, it was still in the Dark Ages. The shadow that had been put across the land was the shadow upon Romano-Christianity, not among society as a whole. And it was also the threats from Islam in the East. And that's why they refer to it as the Dark Ages. It was the Dark Ages for the aristocrats and Roman law. It was probably the Light Ages for anyone else. And these people remembered that, and they were the wild men in the woods, like Merlin, who came out of that. Merlin, through his influence, able to play these games with people, with the power structure, in much the same way, nearly 1800 years later, Rasputin did with the Romanovs. It shows the power of one individual in what they can achieve. The most interesting phrase in all of this over the years I've heard is that the island of Britain was called Merlin's enclosure. It wasn't called Arthur's enclosure or any other king. It was called Merlin's enclosure. The son of a devil and the servant of God had so much power on the island of Britain that it literally was his. In the same way we heard the famous story of Rasputin, he stood naked after the rumors was that he was not only having sex with all the courtesans in the Romanov court, but also with the Tsarina himself, stood on the balcony of his apartment, exposed his genitals to the populace, and said, "These are the tools which rule and guide Mother Russia." Merlin was probably the same kind of character, and this is why it was called Merlin's enclosure. Now, we have absolutely no information about his death. It's almost like he vanished, but he did exist, so we know he existed. We know how he got around. We know how he moved about in the power structures as this guy Midrin, but we do not know what happened to him. The story was that he went to Brittany and France, where he created a round table while the knights of the round table, Arthur and his merry band, were looking for this thing called the Holy Grail, whatever that is. And he's said to have met the enchantress Vivian, and he's held captive in her prison, an invisible prison. Now, when they use terms like an invisible prison, you use it in the same way you think of a secret college or an underground railway. It doesn't actually mean a prison that's invisible. It's talking about a system or a process or a methodology that's unknown to others, other than the adepts and the initiates within the system. It's an invisible prison or secret college to the rest of us. My guess would be the same thing happened Merlin as what happened the Irish Druids that were directly under King Lear at Tara. When Tara fell, King Lear and his Druids did not convert to Christianity themselves. Very significant. What they did was left orders for the next king to convert to Christianity. In the same way, if you look in terms of the timelines, Merlin was before Arthur, and the next king was Arthur, and he converted to Christianity, or converted to in whatever kings he was based upon, converted to Christianity. So you have this schism that happens. The arrival of Christianity on these islands, the Druidic class and the Druids agreeing to allow the law of Rome to take over, as King Lyra at Tara and Mithrin, son of a devil and servant of a god, did in Britain. And then they vanished into an invisible prison. And my speculation is that the invisible prison is Druidism, the old faith, which continues to this very day in secret. I believe that there are people walking around in Europe, in America, and elsewhere who are directly descendant from the Druids at Tara and the Druids in Britain and the Druids in France and the Satyrs in Scandinavia, and they're still here. They did not vanish, they just went underground. And while we have been distracted for years and years by the idea of an Illuminati being the ex-Gnostics, which is probably true, the original Illuminati were believed to be the Gnostics in hiding in Italy and Spain in the 1500s. And there's probably some truth to that. They moved north to France, decloaked as Freemasons, and entered into the Grand Orient Lodge in Paris. When this was discovered, something called the Bavarian Illuminati under Adam Weishaupt, directly working for the Jesuit priests, called themselves the Bavarian Illuminati. They infiltrated the lodges, particularly the Grand Orient Lodge, and ended Gnosticism and replaced it with Republicanism, Romanism, right? Republican Romanism. The Druids are not going to make the same mistake. Who they are, what they are, and where they operate, I have absolutely no idea. But I do know that I have met people in my own life, men here in Ireland, who carried themselves in a way that was almost like what you would imagine someone like the mythological Merlin would be like. They're very difficult to pin these people down, but you have random encounters with them. Sometimes even online we have random encounters with them. Are these the guiding force of the surviving Druid heritage of Europe, moving amongst us, slowly keeping the flame alive? With all the success of Roman Christianity and all the Abrahamic religions, this flame of Druidism has never died out. For instance, was Tennyson, who brought the Arthurian legends to life in the Victorian period, and other people in the arts movement, such as the pre-Raphaelite painters, were they in fact Druids, or working through Druidism to keep this culture alive? Was the Gaelic League of Ireland, who in the late 1800s relaunched the Gaelic revival, very successfully I might add, were they the invisible prisoners? Going back even further, were the monks who wrote the very complex history of mythological Ireland in the Annals and the Ulster cycle, and who had a vested interest in destroying these myths, but instead write them up in such a way that they were guaranteed to last, in the same way Geoffrey of Monmouth did? Were they also Druids working within the church, pretending to be archivists of the heathen ways, but in reality using the power and the archives of Rome to piggyback the old beliefs inside the church as historical and sociological portrayals of the heathens. Were they also sons of the devil and servants of God? Was the invisible prison the church with them inside it, keeping the sacred fires of Tara and Stonehenge and Avebury and Karnak and all the other places in between burning as the ultimate psyop? It would be the equivalent of one of us, say one of you guys out there who doesn't believe that vaccines are safe, getting into the AMA and deliberately writing down all the plausible theories of why people are against vaccines and trying to portray them as the reason why they should be mocked and ridiculed, but in reality writing down the history. This is true consciousness insurgency now, folks. Writing down the history and the story of the anti-vaccine movement in such a way that anyone with a bit of moxie or savvy can read these and say, hold on a second. Although this talks about these vaccine people, anti-vaccine people being crazy, I'm reading this here and they make plausible accounts. Because remember, the psychopaths in charge of any power structure are ultimately stupid in the sense that they do not get a full, shall we say, awareness of things. This is why cults are very easy to infiltrate. All you have to do is pretend to the cult leader that you really do believe that comets with aliens inside them that eat human flesh are coming, and the dumbass psychopathic cult leader will trust you. This is why they're so easy to infiltrate. Now, Roman Christianity being the biggest cult of all you have to do is be the son of the devil and the servant of God. You get in there and you say, I know all about these pagan ways. I know how disgusting, depraved, and their favorite term, unclean, these pagan creatures are. I would like, and my archivist friends and scribes would like, to document these pre-Christian, pagan, and unclean ways of the heathens as a warning to future generations. And then the psychopathic bishops and cardinals go, we give you permission, here's money, blah, 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 blah. And then these invisible prisoners get to work. So when the psychopaths in charge of the church go, I read all about your Tuatha De Danann. Is that how you say it? Tuatha De Danann. These filthy Irish pagans and how they built stones to align them to the sun. I'm not putting down Italians. I'm just trying to do a Roman Pope here. I love Italians, so don't take it that way. So these dogs. Thank you for writing down this. This is great. This is great. Team music from The Godfather playing. Okay. And then the guy goes, thank you, your popeship. We've had we're great. A great bunch of lads here in the Vatican. Here's the Irish Annals. Here's the Altar Cycle. Here is the here's the Lindisfarne Chronicles. Here, have a go, have a read. Put them in your archives and make sure that many people read them. You know yourself, Father. So all these pagans, these pagans are exposed for what they are. I will read it and I will make you a saint. It's bleeding genius when you think about it, isn't it? And when I started this show and I said that by looking at mythology and looking at legend, there are lessons to be learned for us present day in consciousness insurgents going forward. I just gave you examples of how our ancestors, the people that were just like us, the freaks and the conspiranitas like us in the past, got around the control structure. Learn from this. Learn from this. Knowledge is absolute power. The retention of knowledge is vital. All knowledge. Be like the character, the father, in the book The Road by Cormac McCarthy, one of the phenomenal book if you haven't read it. It's also made into a film. He says to the son, we are the keepers of the fire. And as the world in the book The Road was falling apart under darkness, and remember, I think Cormac McCarthy was actually telling us something very deep in that book and that film. Through the whole movie and the book, trees, the woodlands, the groves are constantly collapsing and smashing and falling to the ground, while the father and the son keep the fire. They could have easily been allegories for the Druids, or the ancestors, or the tribal, pagan, native people of the past, keeping their secrets alive in the darkness, as the cannibals of the Roman system fed on everybody and everything in nature and in humanity around them. You think about that one. This is why we're on this exploration of our pre-Christian Merlin, Mithrin, BC ancestors, legends, and stories, because we know that that invisible prison exists, and the Druids are still with us to this day, and they've never left us. They've just went underground, and they've kept that Beltane fire burning. Another fast hour went tonight, and I hope you enjoy it. See you all again this time next week, and remember, you're never alone. There's always someone out there who understands what you're up against with the power structure, and you do not have to walk down the street with a megaphone screaming. You don't have to be paranoid. What you become is a conduit to keep the fire going forward. And you and me and people like us who are switched on, we have an obligation to continue the work of these ancient people who were the sons of the devil and the servants of God. Because we have no choice as transhumanism approaches. Thank you very much. Good night, and feck 'em if they can't take a joke.